We're told that in 1582, in northern Philippines, in Luzon, in the Cagayan River Valley, that a Japanese pirate lord was defeated. His 1,000 Japanese warriors, possibly samurai, were defeated by only 60 Spanish soldiers. And of course, the white supremacists latch onto this story, and they love to death. Oh, the Tercio defeated the samurai, the white power. And obviously the weebs are extremely offended. Well, they're probably not even Japanese. The numbers are all inflated. I'm really not interested in any of that. I'm actually more interested in diving into the sources, figuring out what we can confidently say might have been real, and then figure out how did the Spaniards win, tactically speaking, and how does the outcome of that battle affect us to this very day. It is said that in the year 1582, the Wako pirate lord Tay Fusa was driven from the Cagayan River by Capitan Juan Pablo de Carrion. Okay, let's look at the broader context. The Japanese Warring States era, Sengoku Jidai, was winding down and the shogunate would begin to regulate trade. Seaborne commerce was booming and the Europeans were joining in. For centuries, the Wako, or Wako in Mandarin, these pirates had been ravaging China's coastline. That is until the Ming Dynasty reformed and mustered their army and navy to defeat them. The Ming Dynasty had successfully dismantled many of their networks in the 1560s, and they were not quite the horrifying menace they once were. However, the Wako were still formidable. Ming Dynasty policies were generally prohibitive towards international trade, and thus the armed merchant and pirate organizations needed to find new bases. One such place was Luzon. Hokkien and Japanese merchants had been visiting Luzon for a long time and were well known by the locals. Now, a new player had entered the game. The Spanish Empire had begun conquering the Philippines, but their hold on the islands was still tenuous. They had just wrested Manila from the Sultanate of Brunei and were crushing local resistance from the native kingdoms. Then, in 1574, the Mahong, a Teochew Wako pirate, tried conquering Manila, and when he failed, he took over Pangasinan for a little while before being driven off by the Spaniards. Now, in the 1580s, another character would appear, Tay Fusa, a Japanese pirate lord, and he would try to take over Cagayan. The Japanese came to Luzon every year to exchange silver for gold, their main destinations being Cagayan, Lingayen in Pangasinan, and Manila. The news that arrived shortly after, in 1580 and 1581, indicated that the Japanese were doing some damage to the natives, and already in 1582 there is clearly talk of the pirate TayFusa, who was preparing to go to Cagayan with 10 ships. When Lim Ahong was invading Luzon, Juan de Salcedo in Ilocos originally thought he was heading for Cagayan. However, he later realized he was heading straight for Manila. If we look at the geography, maybe we can determine why the pirate organizations might like the Cagayan River. Luzon has two centers of gravity, one being the stretch from Pangasinan to Quezon, dominated by Manila. It is bordered by mountains on both sides, sheltering it from typhoons, and has good farmlands and a strong population. And the second zone, the Cagayan River Valley, flanked by mountains on both sides, notably to the west by the Cordillera and its fiercely independent highlanders, as well as the Ilocos region. Cagayan is a river of great volume, though its bar forms shallows. At high tide, the bar has 2 brazas of water, and at low tide, 1. On its banks are large settlements with a population of more than 30,000. The people will gather a great quantity of rice and have many swine. There is some gold, but there are no gold mines. They carry on their trade with the men of Ilocos. This region is a sick land, especially when the north wind prevails. And so it seems obvious why a maritime power might try to colonize. Another bit written after these events records, "This year I have sent people to settle the city of Segovia in a province called Cagayan, in this island, 100 leagues from this city. It is the frontier of China, and much benefit is expected from this settlement. For it is the best suited port, with a harbor of great depth, for the ships which sail in the line from Nueva España and Peru, and it is so near to China that one can cross thence in 3 days. For the sake of the future, I consider it very important to have that frontier settled. I sent for the settlement thereof Capitan Juan Pablo de Carrion, and with about 100 picked men. They go in good order, well provided with artillery, vessels, ammunition, and with the approbation and blessings of the church. God will be served through them and your majesty as well." We can clearly see why pirates and the Spaniards wanted Cagayan. Now, what happened? We've got a couple sources. Let's take a look. So, 2 sources. I kind of don't want to read them to you, and I kind of don't want to bombard you with just tons of text on screen. But if I don't give you the direct information, I'm kind of not giving you all the information. And that's one of the problems. A lot of times people will take a glance at the sources, or even just the Wikipedia, and decide they know what really happened. So let's dive into the sources. I'm gonna narrate it for you, and let's analyze. Translated from Espanol to English, letter from Juan Baptista Roman to the Viceroy. Most illustrious and excellent Sir, I do not know whether the letters with new information which the government is writing today will arrive in time to go on this ship, which has been dispatched to this port of Cavite. So I wish to give your excellency notice of what's going on. Yesterday, St. John's Day, in the afternoon, there arrived 6 soldiers who had gone with Capitan Juan Pablo de Carrion against the Japanese, who are settled on the river Cagayan. They say that Juan Pablo sailed with his fleet, which comprised the ship San Giuseppe, the admiral's galley, and 5 fragatas from the port of Bigan, situated in Ilocos, about 35 days' journey from Cagayan. As he sailed out, he encountered a Chinese pirate who very soon surrendered. He put 17 soldiers aboard of her and continued his course. While rounding Cape Borgodor near Cagayan one fair morning at dawn, they found themselves near a Japanese ship which Juan Pablo engaged with the admiral's galley, in which he himself was. With artillery, he shot away their mainmast and killed several men. The Japanese put out grappling irons and poured 200 men aboard the galley, armed with pikes and breastplates. There remained 60 arquebusiers firing at our men. Finally, the enemy conquered the galley as far as the mainmast. There our people also made a stand in their extreme necessity and made the Japanese retreat to their ship. They dropped their grappling irons and set their foresail, which remained to them. At this moment the ship San Giuseppe grappled with them, and with the artillery and forces of the ship overcame the Japanese. The latter fought valiantly until only 18 remained, who gave themselves up, exhausted. Some men on the galley were killed, and among them its captain, Pedro Lucas, fighting valiantly as a good soldier. Then the captain, Juan Pablo, ascended the Cagayan River and found in the opening a fort and 11 Japanese ships. He passed along the upper shore because the mouth of the river is a league in width. The ship San Giuseppe was entering the river, and it happened by bad fortune that some of our soldiers, who were in a small fragata, called out to the captain, saying to him, "Return, return to Manila. Set the whole fleet to return, because there are 1,000 Japanese on the river with a great deal of artillery, and we are few." Whereupon, Capitan Luis de Callejo directed his course seaward, and although Juan Pablo fired a piece of artillery, he did not and could not enter, and continued to tack back and forth. In the morning, he anchored in a bay, where such a tempest overtook them that it broke 3 cables out of 4 that he had, and one used for weighing anchor. He sent these 6 soldiers in a small vessel to see if there was on an islet any water, for which they were in great need. The men lost their way without finding any water, and when they returned where they had left their ship, they could not find it. They met with some of those Indians, Filipinos, who were in the galley with Juan Pablo, from whom it was learned that Juan Pablo had ascended the river 2 leagues and had fortified himself in a bay, and that with him was the galley, which had begun to leak everywhere in the engagement with the Japanese. The Indian crew was discharged on account of not having the supplies, which were lost on the galley. Most of these men went aboard the San Giuseppe. They said that the Japanese were attacking them with 18 champans, which are like skiffs. They were defending themselves well, although there were but 60 soldiers with the seamen, and there were 1,000 of the enemy, of a race at once valorous and skillful. The 6 soldiers came with this news, and on the way they met a sailor who had escaped from a Sangley ship, Filipino-Chinese, which had sailed from there with the supplies of rice for Juan Pablo. He says that the Sangleys mutinied at midnight and killed 10 soldiers who were going with it as an escort, who had no sentinel. This one escaped by swimming, with the aid of a lance that was hurled at him from the ship. Moreover, I have just detained some passengers who were going on this ship because there are no troops on these islands, and 100 soldiers have to go immediately as a reinforcement, although the weather is tempestuous. I expect to be one of them if the governor will give me permission. These enemies, who have in truth remained here, are a warlike people, and if your excellency do not provide by this ship and reinforce us with 1,000 soldiers, these islands can be of little value. May your excellency, with great prudence, provide what is most necessary for his majesty's service, since we have no resource other than the favor your excellency shall order to be extended to us. The governor was disposed to send assistance to the ship, which was a very important affair, but after these events he will not be able to do it because there do not remain in this city 70 men who can bear arms. May our Lord guard the most illustrious and excellent person of your excellency and increase your estate as your excellency's servants desire. From Cavite, June 25th, 1582, most excellent and illustrious sir, your servant kisses your excellency's hands. Juan Baptista Roman. Okay, so this source gives us some idea of what might have transpired during these skirmishes and battles, and it does request for reinforcements. While it is biased towards asking for reinforcements, it does seem like they met stiff Japanese resistance and that there were some logistical problems and confusion on the Spanish side. Next source, letter from Peñalosa to Philip II. Royal Catholic Majesty. By this ship, which is to leave these islands on the last of June this year, I am giving your majesty a full account of the condition of affairs and events in this region. As it was about to sail, news came of the fleet, which, I wrote among other things, I had dispatched to effect a settlement in Cagayan, and of the punishment and resistance of the Japanese pirates, of whose coming we had news this year. The fleet sent by me, as above stated, met 2 vessels of the enemy near Cagayan, one of Japanese and the other of Sangleys. An engagement ensued, and those vessels surrendered after a fierce fight, in which 200 Japanese, among them the commander of the fleet and his son, were killed, while we lost only 3 soldiers. Juan Pablo de Carrion, whom I sent as my lieutenant general in charge of this fleet, continued his journey and entered the Cagayan River, where he was to make a settlement. At the entrance of the river, he found 6 more Japanese vessels belonging to the fleet of those which had surrendered. There was also a goodly number of people there, and fortifications. On account of his lack of men, a severe storm having driven out to sea the flagship, which he took on this expedition, he did not sack these forts, but attempted only to enter the river. This he did, going up about 6 leagues, where he had made a settlement in a place where he could erect a fort, whence he could direct offensive and defensive warfare against the enemy. This news came yesterday, and with all possible dispatch I am sending reinforcements, boats, ammunition, and the provisions necessary. I consider it so needful to employ the soldiers for this purpose, because too small a force remains to me for the aid of Maluco, as I have written, since that undertaking is so important. However, if they send from that place to beg aid, I shall give it with what forces I can, for I suffer a great lack of men and other things, because no reinforcements have been sent me from Nueva España, although I have implored them. This land suffers from a constant and pressing need of reinforcements, on account not only of its unhealthful climate, but of the many emergencies which continually arise when I must send aid. These occasions are now not so much a matter of jest as they have been hitherto, for the Chinese and Japanese are not Indians, but people as valiant as many of the inhabitants of Barbary, and even more so. I entreat your majesty to give careful attention to this, and to order that in all vessels as many men as possible be sent, for it is the key to what is necessary for the preservation of this camp. I beg also that careful attention be given in the other things, the gratuity for the expenses incurred in these necessary undertakings and for others similar to them, which are thrusting themselves forward every moment, which was provided by your Majesty's auditors of your Royal Audiencia de Mexico in the ship arriving at this bay on the 24th of last month, consisted of a decree and warrant in which they order that the Dr. Sande be paid here for the time while he remained here after my arrival, and until his arrival at Mexico. For this purpose they set aside in their decree the tributes which belong to your Majesty, and order that they be attached for this and sent to them, threatening me with imprisonment if I do not comply. I have written to your Majesty already of the poor state of your treasury here, and its many pressing necessities, and of the extreme difficulty experienced in raising the amount needful for the same. Will your Majesty please take suitable action in this? For without the aid of what little resources your Majesty possesses here, this colony cannot be preserved. May our Lord guard the Catholic and royal person of your Majesty for many prosperous years, and give you increases of many kingdoms and seigniories for the good of Christianity. Manila, July 1st, 82. Endorsed to the Royal Catholic Majesty, King Don Felipe, our sovereign, through his Royal Council of the Indies, Governor of the Filipinas. Here I compare the main points from the two sources. Take a look. So there's a marked difference between the two sources. The first one is much more in detail about the trials and tribulations faced by the expedition and some of their logistical difficulties with mutinies, finding water, miscommunication where the San Giuseppe went back out to sea because people were telling them to turn back, and of course fierce resistance from the pirates, which appear to be Japanese according to the account. The second one is much more focused on how the colonial Spanish soldiers acquitted themselves bravely and tactically, but unfortunately are outnumbered, and begging His Royal Majesty to send more reinforcements, give him the resources needed to do his job, and more political blah blah blah.
Okay, so let's assess them tactically. Now, obviously, in this time period, in the 1500s into the early 1600s and a little further on, the Spaniards were some of the baddest motherfuckers on the planet, especially when we talk about open field combat, naval combat, and just close quarters melee as a whole. We have the Spanish tercio, we have the Spanish pike squares with the muskets and arquebus, as well as rodoleros, espadachines, swordsmen, and we have the famed Spanish lancers, right? These are people well conditioned, disciplined, and accustomed to warfare against many different kinds of opponents.
We don't know if Carrion's corps of 60-something Spanish soldiers were necessarily veterans and extremely well trained, but they did handle themselves quite well. As far as Filipinos go, in typical Spanish fashion, they don't really number their auxiliaries very reliably. Judging by the ships, we could probably guess maybe 100 to 300. I'm going to guess that they were armed spear and shield with short swords and archery, not trained in the Spanish fashion at this point.
How Japanese were these Wako? I, for one, believe, judging from the context and the evidence, that TayFusa's men were a predominantly Japanese force. Let me explain.
Yes, Wako were multi-ethnic pirate crews, often with strong representation by Hokkien and Japanese. While some were majority Japanese, others were majority Chinese. Some commenters feel this room for diversity means that these pirates were largely non-Japanese. But here we must look at the sources and the context. Spaniards here knew about Japanese people. There was a Japanese community in Manila. The Japanese sent annual trade missions. There were Japanese Christians here and in Kyushu, Japan. They knew of other Japanese pirates and could describe clothing, armor, and weapons as being Japanese or Hokkien or Pintado or Moro, etc. They knew a name for the Japanese sword was katanes. And when Limahong invaded, his lieutenant was referred to as Shioko by the Spanish, which correspond to shoko in Japanese as an officer. Tay Fusa is unlikely to be the Wako leader's name, but corresponds to the medieval Japanese for chief, TayFusa. And so with these vivid descriptions of what are seemingly Japanese people, Japanese traits, it seems to me that they understood who they were dealing with. Of course, this isn't proof, but it points us in the direction that the Spaniards were not ignorant of the various players in the game.
So all that being said, I do believe that most of these Wako were Japanese. Could there have been samurai or ronin amongst them that were classically trained in bujutsu and had battlefield experience? Possible. Is it likely that they were the majority of this operation? I doubt it, although I have no way to confirm. Now, these were most likely seasoned pirates, but they were most likely not well trained nor experienced in open field combat and that type of disciplined group cohesion form of training. Nevertheless, the Spaniards give credit where credit is due and point out that they were belligerent and skillful warriors, that they did not lack in martial prowess. And I take this to mean that most likely, given their puritanical profession, that they were good individual warriors. They were good fighters, but just not necessarily well adapted and trained, nor necessarily motivated for the type of combat that they faced against the Spaniards in Cagayan.
All right, so both sources begin with a Chinese ship or a Sangli ship being taken by Juan Pablo. Then we have that interesting fight between the Japanese ship and the galley that Juan Pablo is in. So we don't know exactly what kind of ship it was, but this ship was able to counterattack and launch a boarding party of about 200, so it is said, while leaving about 60 on board to continue firing with their arquebus. So these supposedly Japanese pirates were able to fight the Spaniards up to their own mainmast, armed with pikes and breastplates. Not sure, but due to casualties, maybe even the loss of their leader, they retreated onto their ship and began to use their foresail to get away, but then the San Giuseppe showed up and they got destroyed, and only 18 survived to surrender. It's interesting to me that with these Wako, these Japanese pirates, or at least the Japanese elements within these multi-ethnic groups, they're usually depicted wearing just regular clothing, maybe just a shirt and a sword or a pike, sometimes using archery as well. In this case, they have breastplates, pikes, and arquebus. And so this shows that there is another level of preparation and military capability. Peñalosa claims that only 3 Spanish soldiers died, where Juan Baptista Roman says that this was a very hard fight, and even the galley commander Pedro Lucas died in the fighting. Peñalosa claims that the Japanese ship commander and his son were killed in the battle. Although there may be some exaggeration and contradiction here, I believe that the galley probably suffered some casualties to its crew and some of its soldiers, but perhaps not the majority of them. Both sources now agree that Juan went to the Cagayan River mouth and there was a Japanese force. Whether it was 11 Japanese ships and a fort or 6 Japanese ships, many men, and forts is hard to say, but clearly he is outnumbered. Now our two sources disagree on why the fleet did not join up with Juan Pablo. Peñalosa blames this on a storm, whereas in Juan Baptista Roman's account, the storm is just one of the many mishaps. According to him, not only was there a storm, one of the Fragata's crews was telling the San Giuseppe crew to turn back due to being outnumbered. Juan, for his part, had to fortify himself in a bay where he was under attack by 18 sampans full of Japanese pirates. He had to send men out to find water. He had let go of Indians or Filipinos due to being low on provisions. And a supply ship that was coming in, a Sangli ship, actually mutinied. So a lot of things were going wrong logistically in terms of communication, cohesion, etc. Now here's the implied epic battle between Juan Pablo's beleaguered force of 60 or so soldiers and whatever crewmates were with them, Filipinos most likely, against 18 boatfuls of Japanese. We don't really know what quote-unquote champans are. They're supposedly like skiffs. If that is the case, this can range anywhere from a small boat to a small sailboat. Regardless, we know that they were outnumbered. Estimates vary widely as far as how many pirates there were. We don't know, obviously. It could range from 500-600 to 1,000 on the high end. Aside from their usual armaments, such as yari or spears, pikes, tachi and uchigatana swords, they might have had breastplates and arquebus and even artillery. Now, if these Wako are part of the same organization that ship was, and if they fight in a similar fashion as most other recorded incidents with Wako in the past, then we can infer a few things. Nobody doubts their ferocity in fighting, but they likely engage the enemy in mass as quickly as possible to try to shock and break them. The whole sophisticated battlefield maneuvers and formation training was probably not something that they had a lot of experience with as a whole. It is said that the Spaniards had to grease up their pike shafts in order that the Japanese pirates would not be able to grab them. If this is true, it indicates quite a level of skill as far as displacing pikes, grabbing them and charging in to cut up the formation. It's said that Juan Pablo de Carrion was a very experienced soldier and leader, and if so, his experience certainly showed. Now clearly the Wako were well armed and fierce enough to subdue the Cagayan natives, but now they were up against a hardened Spanish force. Even though de Carrion was in a tough position and outnumbered, I think he had a few advantages. So they say his galley was leaking, he sheltered in a bay and entrenched himself there. This implies that the 18 sampans full of pirates were not able to land all at once and overrun de Carrion's position. And if they did land a little further out and advance on foot, they would still hit a choke point situation. Pirates fighting in close quarters would have had to go up against a Spanish force that was defensively advantageous, trained to operate in combined arms formations involving pikes, swords and shield, and arquebus, while backed up by the artillery taken from the galley. And we know from the Ming Dynasty experience fighting the Wako that a disciplined, cohesive combined arms formation was very effective against them. Aiding the core of Spanish soldiers might have been 100, 200 crewmates or native auxiliaries. We don't know the numbers. Now you may say, well, the Japanese had artillery and arquebusiers of their own, right? And while that is probably true, from their particular lanes of attack, they may not have been able to effectively use them while being shot at. On top of the fact they may not have been properly trained in their use, they may not have been accurate shots, and they may not have been used to besieging and storming an entrenched position by a foe with as good or better training and armaments. On top of all this, we have to consider the fact that Juan Pablo de Carrion may have been a better leader than Tay Fusa. He may have used tactical measures such as trenches and other works in order to mitigate the Japanese advantages. And at the end of the day, the pirates were there to extract profit. Thus, the level of morale as well as their motivations probably differed. It is said that Tay Fusa actually offered to be paid off, compensated for his losses in order that he would leave Cagayan peacefully. Being unable to dislodge Juan Pablo de Carrion and with the rest of the Spanish force at the mouth of the river, we can see how despite having more warriors, Tay Fusa was trapped. And Juan Pablo, whether realizing the strategic situation or just out of bravery and stubbornness, would refuse to pay off Tay Fusa. They would be defeated through military force.
In terms of overall strategy, I can understand why Tay Fusa did what he did. Cagayan makes sense. He saw Limahong attack Manila and then Pangasinan, and with that not working out, he went to Cagayan. Now, of course, I don't know that he knew, but these events line up with what we know of the economy and the geography and the geopolitics at that time. Now, I believe that Tay Fusa may not have been prepared for a Spanish offensive. It definitely seems like with the initial naval battles that they were in some ways caught off guard. Secondly, he may have also underestimated Spanish capabilities in open field combat and in naval combat. I think he perhaps had his men fight in a way that was to the Spaniards' favor. And in fact, if he had been able to catch the Spaniards in an area where maybe they were caught off guard, they could not use their combined arms formation to good effect, and his men were able to catch them in a big, messy melee where their numbers were scattered about, he may have won. He seemed to be kind of a predatory presence. Of course, we only know what the Spaniards tell us, and so they obviously will justify their own rule. If Tay Fusa had succeeded in holding on to Cagayan, maybe history would be very different, with a Japanese non-state actor ruling the northern half of Luzon. Wow. But obviously, history has gone the way it has. This is our reality. And in 1575, Lim Ahong was driven from Pangasinan. 1582, Tay Fusa was defeated by Carrion. And later, in 1588, supposedly a retainer of Matsura Shigenobu, a man named Juan, probably a Japanese Christian, was seen in the Manila area offering protection to natives that would give him land and tribute. So clearly the pirates and their benefactors, daimyos, were not done with the Philippines. They were still looking for an overseas base for their trading and piracy operations, with the shogunate taking stronger control over Japan itself and regulating trade, with the Spaniards having a firmer grip over Luzon itself and the rest of the Philippines, and the Ming Dynasty, outside of the tributary system, having a very prohibitive policy towards maritime trade. You're blocking off these zones, and these pirates and armed merchants need to go somewhere to meet the rising demand for this international maritime trade and all that it brings. And what's right in the middle? Japan, China, Philippines. Right in the middle is Taiwan, Formosa, Ilha Formosa back then. And these events would forever change Taiwan's history, and Taiwan's history would forever change the world. I enjoy sharing these historical and cultural regional stories, not just for understanding, but also for perspective on our world. I hope you guys enjoyed that story about Tay Fusa's defeat. Thank you guys for following me on my journey. I salute yours. Peace.